So yeah, I'm going to talk to you about the joys of major depression. And I'm going to tell you the story about my struggle with depression from a few years ago. And I have a few reasons that I'm sharing the story. One is that I'd like to normalize conversations about depression and mental illnesses. We've come a long way, but we still have a long way to go to destigmatize this. Another reason is that, about 1 in 20, there's a point prevalence, 1 in 20 of us right now are suffering from depression in this room, according to the average. And if you're suffering, I'd like to tell you you're not alone. And I'm hoping that I might inspire some of you to help someone in need. I don't really have slides, I'm just going to tell you the story. So I find it interesting as a doctor that we treat mental illnesses so differently. Our health insurance covers it much more poorly. It's also interesting as a physician that when we're applying for credentialing or licensure, that we get invasive questions about our mental illness history, even though that's against the American with Disabilities Act. In fact, the Joint Commission and the Federation of State Medical Boards recommends that we don't ask those invasive questions because studies have shown that doctors are less likely to seek help because of this. In any case, how do we define depression? Well, we use a thing called the DSM, or the Diagnostic Statistical Manual. It's version 5 right now. And it has a list of 8 potential symptoms. And you need at least 5 to qualify as having major depressive episode. And one of which has to either be depressed mood or lack of joy. When you define a disease in this way, it's kind of challenging because it brings up questions. For example, if you have 5 versus 8 symptoms, what does that mean? And or if everyone has different mixes of these symptoms, are they really all one disease? What does it mean if you go from 5 to 4? Does that mean you're cured? How do you measure disease severity? So what we do is we use clinical scales, and they're supposed to provide a numerical score that roughly correlates with the severity of illness, and they're useful because you can track disease over time. You can give these clinical tools to patients and evaluate them repeatedly. And they're also useful for trying to measure the effects of interventions. Now, the course of the disease is such that most cases last for several months, but any case can last any period of time, including becoming chronic. The average patient typically has about 4 or 5 episodes during their lifetime, and the overall lifetime prevalence in America is about almost 20%. And it's estimated that about 60% of people with depression actually don't seek help. In my own case, my depression started with the workplace stress, and I did seek help. I went to a psychiatrist and received antidepressants. I saw a psychologist and engaged in behavioral therapy. But despite that help, my depression lasted for a long time, for 2.5 years. It was a long struggle. And during that time, I was what I call a functional depressive. I never missed a day of work. And in a really demanding work environment, I got satisfactory performance reviews. I wasn't stellar, but in a demanding work environment like that, I was pretty functional. And you might ask, well, did you really have depression if you were that functional? And in my case, most of my dysfunction was in the personal space. I think my family would describe me as completely checked out. I had a major problem with anhedonia, or lack of joy. And I had these really maladaptive behaviors that I would engage in to try to escape the pain. I would do puzzles obsessively. I did the New York Times through the archive all the way back to the 1940s, every single one. I would do things like start binge watching a show at 11 o'clock when I was going to bed, a series that I didn't even care about, and I would watch it through the night, and then the next morning commute to work for 45 minutes on the New Jersey Turnpike. I was a dangerous driver in those days, and I had so many accidents that I got dropped by most insurers. On top of that, when I was driving, sometimes I would get suicidal thoughts, and I thought how easy it would be to just end this all by just crashing my minivan into something. And in fact, I decided to consult Dr. Google and say, how often does that occur? Suicide by car accident. It was interesting to find out we really don't know much about it, but it's suspected that it's more prevalent than we can really measure. So you might ask, well, how did I recover after all that? And the somewhat embarrassing answer to that is by shopping. And you might say, how could that possibly be? One of the things is that I needed to get something to get engaged with. And I went to an open house with my sister-in-law from London, and we saw an apartment, and we got back, and she commented that she thought it was overpriced. And I thought, what does this person from London, I mean, you know, London's sophisticated, but what does she know about New York real estate? So I did what any good New Yorker should do. I went to Street Easy and did some investigation. And I discovered that, in fact, at that time, the inventory of 3 bedrooms was about at least twice as large as what I had seen in the past. That there were stale properties, like properties that were around for more than 52 weeks, some properties that were being discounted, and I realized, oh, I think this might be a buyer's market. Maybe Amy and I can finally get that 3-bedroom apartment. And that was a project because, you know, buying real estate is a complicated transaction, and you need expert consultants. And for me, getting experts and consultants was reaching out to friends and asking them for recommendations. And this is something that I hadn't been engaging with for at least 2.5 years. And so, you know, when you're depressed, the way things go is that, you know, you think, oh, you know, I should reach out to Steve. I haven't talked to him in a while. And then your next thought would be, well, you know what? Steve hasn't reached out to me. But then you say, oh, you know what? I should reach out to him anyway. But then your next thought becomes, well, maybe I'll do that tomorrow. And then tomorrow becomes another day. And pretty much you find out 2.5 years later you haven't been talking to anyone. Well, anyway, I realized with this project that I was reaching out to friends, and they were great, they helped me, but then I also started reaching out to people who had nothing to do with my purchasing a new apartment. And by the end of that week, I was 90% back to myself, which is a kind of extraordinary story. So my psychiatrist said, I'm sorry, but I need to interview your wife to confirm the details of the story because it just sounds crazy. But he accepted that, in fact, I had actually managed to recover from my depression this way. So I guess if I ever have this happen again, I'll just have to remember to go shopping. But anyway, so now that I've recovered, I discovered that there were some joys associated with it, that some things that I had learned, I wouldn't wish this upon myself or anyone else, but there were insights that I got from the process. And one was that I had a newfound empathy for people with mental illness. And I know this because in the past few years, it's been interesting. I've been engaging with all sorts of people and talking to them about their challenges, either historic or current. And that was something that's new. The other thing that I learned was that I had a new fearlessness. You know, having gone through that, I realized no one could really hurt me nearly as much as I could hurt myself. And that had an impact on both kind of my professional life and personal life. In the professional space, about a year after I recovered, I was working in a biotech startup, and for the first time in my life, I got terminated. And I would say that for a lot of us, having your first termination of your job as a high-performing professional tends to be an existential crisis. And it was interesting. It wasn't like I was happy that it happened, but I viewed it rationally. I just was like, okay, well, I had a manager who didn't want my input, and he treated me with disrespect, so this is an opportunity to find a better place to apply my talents. The other thing I've learned is that because I have no social fears anymore, I'm open even more than I was before, and I find that I'm making new friends of all different types at a fast clip so that my social network always seems to be expanding. And I think part of that might be also that I pursue my interests with abandon. I continue to perform the violin. I had my second concert in Zanko Hall recently in Carnegie. I took up singing during the pandemic, and now I sing with Broadway singers in various piano bars in New York. I took up conducting. I went to a workshop with a classmate, Ben Loeb, now study that at Juilliard. I started doing stand-up comedy a couple years ago, and now perform in various comedy clubs in New York. And in January of 2022, some of you follow me on Instagram, I started a public Instagram, just sharing my interest in watches and other things like that. And somehow it gained traction, and I now have 760,000 followers, so. Anyway, so in closing, I just wanted to say that I hope I gave you a little bit of a picture of at least one experience with depression. I would say, as I said before, 1 in 20 of us are suffering from depression, so that means that most likely someone in our personal or professional lives might be struggling, and we might notice this. And I would suggest to you that you might want to ask after that person in an empathetic way. It could be that they're just suffering from something acute, some acute challenge in their life. It doesn't have to be mental illness. But if it is, it could be one of those 60% of people who don't get help, and you're asking about them might get them to seek help. And the other thing to remember is that, unfortunately, about 10 to 15% of people with major depressive episode commit suicide. So your intervention might actually save a life.